The devil is a tyrant through the fear of death.
Mm-hmm.
And when the devil is destroyed, we are now, Hebrews 2:14 and 15 says, set free from the bondage of the fear of death.
Mm.
So let's start with this, is that the fear of death is bondage. And the way it would work in the martyrs is, let's just go back to the old kind of original times of martyrdom. And these Roman proconsuls would say, hey, you got to offer the incense or I'm going to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the Christians they were afraid to die. So they do whatever was required so that they wouldn't face death. That's how the fear of death is bondage for us. Now, all of us are, I think, natively and instinctively afraid to die. Mm-hmm. It's part of our fallen nature. So we just got to face that up. Not only am I dying, but I'm also afraid to die. Okay, so that's not something that the Lord wants of me. So now, what is the work that the Spirit does? The Spirit comes to us and gives us this confidence, the hope that we were talking about earlier,
mm-hmm.
that for us to live as Christ, to die is gain. And here we gather all these beautiful, sweet names of death
mm-hmm.
that the Bible talks about. Francis Pieper has a little footnote, and it's about the nomine morte dulce, the names of the sweet names of death.
Okay, yeah.
The candy sweet names of death. And he goes through the list of them: to be gathered to the fathers, to depart in peace, gain. Beautifully, the Lord says sleep, mm-hmm. sleep. So that our death is not it's not an end. It's just a falling. And when you fall asleep, you're going to wake up.
Mm-hmm.
To my favorite, at the very end of Revelation, to see the face of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Blessed are those who die in the Lord. So that we have all these sweet names of death. They're not euphemistic like our culture uses, like pass on or kick the bucket or whatever. Yeah. But no, we speak of death in real terms, but in sweet, beautiful terms.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why death is a gift to us is because, it was that following death was judgment, mm-hmm. but not anymore, because Christ has died for us. And so there is nothing to judge. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Death is the way to life eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And that freedom from the fear of death sets us free to serve and to suffer and to rejoice through all of these afflictions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the joy of the martyrs. So there's a lot of different ways to go here, but maybe
can I just kind of a quick aside. Can you look up Bennett? I've got two, but the second one is, who's the guy that played Batman in The Dark Knight? Christian Bale. Christian Bale has a movie. Yeah, that might be it. He can't fall asleep. Yeah. He lost however many pounds.
I don't know that one.
The Machinist. I'll get to that in a sec. But there's this aspect where Paul's kind of saying, his whole life has been preparing for this. This becomes the real adventure, and the real adventure is him, going into death. But that movie, The Machinist, it's not like an enjoyable watch. So he's just this really sickly machine worker, and he can't fall asleep. So he just he's completely miserable. And I think the way it plays out in the end, are you pulling up? Yeah, that's it. The way it plays out in the end, he's got insomnia. Factory worker Trevor suffers from insomnia so severe that his condition has taken its toll on his weight and his mental health. When Trevor unintentionally causes an on-the-job accident that horribly injures a coworker, he becomes even more troubled. Despite a relationship with a pretty prostitute, Trevor descends further into paranoia, blaming his problems on an enigmatic figure named Devon. Yeah, and then the beautiful thing at the very end, which I don't mind giving it away, it's a pretty old movie, but he, if you're going to watch this and you don't want the ending, pauses for a second or turn the volume down, but he finally admits to his sins that he's committed in his past, and I think it might be attached to even that accidental death that he contributed to. And then there's this beautiful scene. The whole movie is really dark. It's all at dusk, right? And then he's going through this tunnel, and he's riding in a car, and then he kind of falls asleep as they're coming out of the tunnel into this light. And the whole point is he hasn't been able to go through his baptismal death. He hasn't been able to confess of his sins, and because of that, he's kind of stuck not falling asleep. But once he kind of falls asleep, he releases this, and then he kind of enters into this heavenly picture. It's a beautiful. I mean, it's a pretty powerful movie. I can't tell you how theologically accurate it is, but
That's
some of the
it.
overtures are.
That's amazing. Well, you have I mean, this from Psalm 32. When I kept silent, my bones waxed old for groaning
Mm,
all the day long, and I confessed my sins unto you, and you forgave the. So that there's a connection to health and a good conscience.
hmm
I mean, this is where and this is why the Lord has instituted the church to give us a good conscience, and
hmm
that's what I mean. That not being afraid to die is having a good conscience.
hmm
Though it's the same thing, because I know there is no condemnation for me on the other side of death, and so we're ready to die. In fact, so I was, people always ask me, Pastor, is it okay to want to die, and to ask the Lord to take me to heaven? And I said, you've asked the Lord to take you to heaven every day of your life
hmm
when you prayed, deliver us from evil. And
mm
that's what you're praying for. I mean,
hmm
what do you think you're praying for? To deliver from evil? Like the Lord's going to take you out of this like evil city and put you on top of the mountain, but you're still there.
hmm
To be delivered from evil is to be taken to the Lord's face in heaven, to be
hmm
rescued from sin outside and inside, to be delivered in that way. Beautiful. So that, yeah, we long for that. And and what that means is when we rejoice in this life as a gift from God, no matter how good or bad it is, that we also rejoice in death from God. That means that there's no access point for the devil's assaults.
hmm
Um, the Lord gives, blessed be the name of the Lord. The Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. No matter what happens, the Lord's name is blessed.
hmm
So I think the picture to illustrate this, there's this old hymn. I tracked it down the other. I used to think it was by Thomas Aquinas, but it's not. It's maybe about Thomas Becket,
Okay.
and Luther quotes it. And I've got there's a line in there. He's talking about his martyrdom. And it says, unknowingly, they lead us to bliss.
Mm,
And the picture is that the devil who comes and says, hey, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cause you to suffer. Unknowingly, he leads us to bliss.
mm,
Unknowingly, unwillingly, he gives us the very thing that we wanted in the first place.
mm,
It's like if you and I are walking over to lunch and thugs in a van with no windows grab us and duck tie us and throw us in the back of the van and drive us to Texas Roadhouse and drop us off with a gift card. It's
hmm
like, oh, that's cool. This
Yeah.
is exactly where I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And the devil says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill you and take you to Jesus, which is exactly where we want to be in the first place.
hmm
Unknowingly, it leads us to bliss.
hmm
So that if we are unafraid to die, in fact, if we recognize that to live is Christ, therefore to die is gain, there's what can man do to me?
hmm
I'm not afraid of the one who can destroy my body, but the one who destroys body and soul in hell, that's God,
hmm
who doesn't intend to destroy body and soul in hell. So here's the picture. Remember those guys that they vowed to not eat or drink until they killed St. Paul?
Yeah.
And those guys had to be pretty hungry because Paul's nephew finds out about it
hmm
and comes in. How he found out, I don't know. That's kind of a cool story.
It
But he
is, yeah.
tells Paul, he says, oh, tell the guy in charge. And okay, so they get to Calvary and they rescue Paul in night and then take him halfway to Caesarea and get him there and put him in jail. And he's in Caesarea for 3 years. And then they failed.
Yeah.
But imagine that we're like part of that little group of St. Paul haters. And we gather around and we're like, all right, what are we going to do? We hate St. Paul. He's the worst. And one guy says, let's murder him. I say, good idea. Murder him. How are we going to murder him? Stab him, throw rocks at him, poison him. What are we going to do? And we're trying to figure out what's the best way to murder him until one guy says, well, okay, look, this is great. We should murder him, except for here's the problem. I read this letter that he wrote to his friends in Philippi, and he says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If we murder him, we'd be giving him what he wants.
hmm
In fact, he says, I desire to depart and be with Christ. Well, now what are we going to do? All right, well, can't murder him. Got to take that off the table. Well, let's cause him to suffer. And you're trying to figure out, if you want to give him a bunch of paper cuts and rub salt on his wounds, or how are we going to cause him to suffer?
Yeah.
until one guy says, well, okay, this is great. I think he should suffer lots, tons. But I read this letter that he wrote to his friends in Rome, and he says, count it all joy when you suffer trials of various kinds, knowing that suffering produces patience, and patience character, and character hope. And that doesn't disappoint us because God has poured his Spirit into our hearts so that he rejoices in his suffering, this guy.
Mm-hmm.
So if we cause him to suffer, we're increasing his joy.
Mm-hmm.
Just imagine the frustration. What are we going to do? We'll just leave him alone. That's like the worst thing you can do to Paul is ignore him.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore him because you're already obsessed with him. You can't, and this is the problem with the devil. He cannot ignore Christ, and he cannot ignore the Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And even the sinful world cannot ignore Christians. It can't just, it can't just leave this thing it doesn't believe is true alone. But there's nothing. So you imagine the frustration of being the devil trying to plot against St. Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And Bryan, it's the same for you and for me and for all who belong to Jesus. Imagine the frustration of the devil plotting against you, because for you to live as Christ and to die as gain,
mm-hmm.
and you rejoice in your suffering. Just the same as St. Paul. It's the same for you. The same for me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that everything the devil does ends up bringing about God's will
mm-hmm.
and his glory and our salvation, and he cannot help it.